I want to get back to that breaking news right there in that vehicle is Luigi Mangione, who has now, the suspect, of course, in the CEO killing here in New York City earlier on this month. Then that manhunt, captured in Pennsylvania. We're waiting to see if he would waive extradition to face charges, both state and possible federal charges here in New York. And he is going to be now brought back to New York. I want to bring Brian Buckmeyer back in. Brian, as we're watching Mangione leave court after waiving extradition, what do you expect next steps?
So what I expect next is Pennsylvania being just next to us here in the state of New York, that the law enforcement would expedite the transfer, whether it be through a flight or I think it's like a 5.5-hour drive. I'm not sure which they will do. But I would expect, what, it's like 10:17 local time, that the court usually takes a break from 1 to 2:30 in the afternoon. I'd expect by this afternoon he would be in a Manhattan court hearing that indictment against him based on the Manhattan DA's presentation to the grand jury.
And when it comes to the indictment and the charges he's facing, just separate for us to the state and the federal charges.
Yeah, so right now we know that from a federal standpoint that they are presenting evidence and that there might be either a grand jury indictment or at least a complaint for federal charges. And so we don't know what the federal charges are as of yet. Of course, there's a potential for murder that we know has a max penalty of the death penalty at federal court. In New York, we know that Luigi Mangione was originally charged with a complaint for murder in the second degree, but through a grand jury presentation, they came back with an elevated charge of murder in the first degree in furtherance of terrorism. New York doesn't have the death penalty, so the highest penalty that is afforded for that murder in the first degree is life without the possibility of parole.
You know, his attorneys have already come out and said that they're piling on and the charges are an overreach. But talk about the qualification. Talk about why one would be charged with a terrorism count and why it might fit, or why the prosecution at least says it fits in this case.
So I understand the defense attorney's position, and I agree in some part and disagree in others. It is very possible for someone to be charged for the same action both in state and federal court, there being different charges. We've seen this, for example, in former officers who are charged with killing someone, being charged in both state and federal court. It's not an issue of double jeopardy. Now, the prosecution in charging Luigi Mangione with terrorism, I personally disagree. I don't see the facts as they're laying it out here. But what they're saying is that Luigi Mangione killed an individual, that being Brian Thompson, and did so based on a statute that says, and the only element that I can think of matches this, because two of them apply to a government, one of them says if you try to intimidate and or coerce a civilian population, that can be considered terrorism. The example being is if I said, I want something to be done, I want to get hired for this job, I want the UnitedHealthcare to stop with a certain policy, or I will do X, Y, and Z, that's a form of intimidation or coercion, especially if I do that action. That would be murder in the first degree.
All right, Brian, the prosecutor is speaking in Pennsylvania. I want to take a listen. Listen with me.
The fourth date is the first of those times, so there would probably be between 200 and there'll be several hundred cases called that day, and essentially they're statused. So the case could be continued, it could be addressed remotely. There are a lot of options, and frankly, depending on his availability, it would be probably up to Attorney Dickey and Mr. Mangione as to whether he continues or appears virtually.
So at what point would it be paused, if it is?
The two factors would be his attorney requesting a delay, if they believe that's in his best interest, or the Commonwealth indicating that he's not available because the other prosecution and prosecuting entity can't produce him at this time.
How's he getting transported then? You said it might be road, is it helicopter, do you know how?
In the manner determined by the New York City Police Department to be the safest and most secure.
What's been your reaction to a lot of the negative attention the city of Elton has received? People saying police should have just turned a blind eye, or that that person in McDonald's should have just minded their own business.
I'm grateful that the police did their job. I'm grateful that that citizen, like so many other citizens in Blair County, said something when they saw something. And I would echo the sentiments of several other people, including our governor. We can all disagree with each other, but we should disagree with each other civilly, and we should never use violence to effectuate a disagreement. I understand these are allegations only against Mr. Mangione, but I certainly violence to make your point is never acceptable in our country, in our system of justice.
Going off of that, there are people outside right now who are in Luigi Nintendo hats holding these signs showing support for him. What do you say to them?
That's their right as Americans to do that, as long as they do it peaceably.
Procedurally and legally, am I right in understanding Mr. Dickey withdrew the habeas petition in the context of the extradition, but reserved the right to file another one? So what, are these two different habeas?
They're two different things. Attorney Dickey filed a habeas corpus petition relative to the defendant's extradition and was contesting extradition, which is his right to do. The Commonwealth was working with the New York City Police Department and Manhattan District Attorney's Office to secure the necessary paperwork, which we do relatively frequently in the course of business in our office. We frequently extradite people to Blair County and send people to other states in the regular course of business. At any time, a defendant can change their mind and decide to waive that, which eliminates the need for that habeas hearing. And that's what happened today. For his preliminary hearing, because we wanted to turn the defendant over to New York as soon as possible today, we had agreed immediately that if there was a waiver of the preliminary hearing, we would agree to what's called a reservation of habeas corpus rights, which is specific to the Pennsylvania Rules of Criminal Procedure. Typically, when a defendant waives, they do not have the right to contest their prima facie case at the courthouse. In this instant, because of the logistics of wanting to turn him over to New York immediately, we agreed for them to be able to preserve that right. So at some time in the future, the defendant, could file a habeas corpus petition relative to his local charges here, and the Commonwealth would have to produce evidence and satisfy a common pleas judge that we have a prima facie case, or essentially a probable cause case, for all of the charges levied against the defendant. Yes, sir.
Sir, when you guys were in chambers for about 45 minutes in between both meetings, which judge were you speaking to?
The judge that presided over the extradition process, which was Judge David Consiglio.
Can we ask about the topics discussed?
The topics were limited to Attorney Dickey's request to have a custom extradition form, which he did not have, and he requested the judge type up for him, which the judge accommodated and had that typed up.
What's on that custom extradition form? Like, what's customized about it?
Just what we said earlier. An acknowledgement that there was a habeas file, that he had an attorney, that he withdrew it.
You mentioned, do you see any possibility for additional criminal charges in Blair County?
Don't speculate on additional criminal charges.
Neil, to the police document, the 20-page document that you got remotely turned over today.
Yes.
Is there an explanation as to why Luigi came out to them?
This is still an ongoing criminal case, so I'm not going to comment on investigatory materials. We turn them over to defense attorneys because every defendant is entitled to see the evidence against them, and we always try to get that out to them through counsel as soon as possible when we receive it. But I don't comment on that to the media. Yes, sir.
One of the points of conversation or the changes that they wanted made to that waiver was removing the acknowledgement that he was treated properly by police so that there was no issues. Can you elaborate any more on what sort of issues he might have experienced or the reason that they wanted that language removed?
No, I don't believe he experienced any issues at all. I'm not going to speak to Attorney Dickey's motivations to the last-minute demand for changes, but we certainly wanted to go forward today with the waiver of extradition, and we're willing to accommodate because, as you saw, there was a large contingent of folks and officers from the New York City Police Department that came down here. The Pennsylvania State Police provided resources. The Altoona Police Department provided resources. The Sheriff's Department's been working around the clock since Mangione's apprehension. Our office has devoted resources. The Hollidaysburg Borough Police Department devoted resources. So the first assistant and I certainly we're willing to accommodate a request for Attorney Dickey to have his own form if that effectuated the transfer of custody of the defendant.
Is the police report available publicly?
No.
You said he's being transported to New York right now. Do you know where he's going to be held?
I do not.
People might hold their eyes on me for these questions, and just so I make sure I understand legally, if his prosecution's proceeding in New York and they can't transport him, does that toll Rule 600, or how does that work if it's not like a defense request or a joint request?
That's a fair question. Rule 600 requires the Commonwealth to exercise due diligence. So ultimately, the interpretation or determination as to whether we exercise due diligence would be determined by a judge. But I've always held the position that as long as we're in position to bring someone back from a surrounding state or state anywhere, if we're willing to do that and they indicate they're not available at this time, I've always argued that that's due diligence. I will argue that in this case. I certainly think as a practical matter, it would have been laughable and a waste of resources and time for us to try to keep this defendant here for our charges and delay New York's custody of the defendant for the more serious case.
Pete, how has this been for you, your office, dealing with all of the media that's here, meeting with all of the world or little house? How has this been for you and for your office these last several days?
Well, you folks have been very nice to us, which we appreciate. We certainly don't try to get into the spotlight, and we certainly look forward to getting back to a lot of work that needs to get done for our cases. But so there has been interruptions to the normal course of business, but those were necessary interruptions, and we certainly understand the interest in the case.
I was actually going to ask someone about that. You listed numerous resources that were used on this case. What sort of strain has that put on not just the DA's office, but on all of the offices here in the
Well, we are lucky in Blair County, and I say this all the time. We have police officers who they don't complain. They work extra. They show up when they're asked, and that's what's happened over the past 2 weeks. Police officers have worked extra shifts. Police departments have volunteered help. Everyone's worked together. There hasn't been any, pushing or shoving, so to speak, as to who gets to do what. It's been a cooperative effort. I've always been grateful for that. And because of that, I would say it's been more work. It certainly has taken resources, but it's been accomplished very smoothly because of the cooperation of everybody.
Going forward, will Attorney Dickey represent Mangione in the ongoing Pennsylvania?
I have absolutely no idea what Attorney Dickey or Mr. Mangione will elect to do. Those are decisions for them that I have no say in, and I'm not going to speculate on that.
Do you believe Mr. Mangione can receive a fair trial here, given sort of the public interest in the case?
I believe a defendant in America can receive a fair trial everywhere when the rules are followed. And I certainly would have no doubt that the rules would be followed in New York as they would be followed here. You'd be surprised how many people don't read the papers. And even when they do, when you've done the number of trials that First Assistant Smith and I have done throughout our careers, the questions juries ask in trials, even high-profile trials, show me that they're paying attention, they're conscientious, and they really want to evaluate the evidence. So I have no doubt that he can receive a fair trial.
What's been the most challenging aspect of this case for you, for your office, and for the wider community?
The challenges for our office is that we're short-staffed and we have a pretty high caseload per capita in Blair County. So it's just been, the resource issue. But other than that, these things are something we do all the time in our office. They just don't normally get attention, and certainly not this level of attention. But there are things we do in the normal course of business.
Just to wrap up, could you give us like a 20-second summary of what comes next in the
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of your sentence, sir.
Would you mind giving us like a 20-second summary of what comes next in the Blair County trial?
Well, because of the defendant's reversal today and decision to waive his preliminary hearing, as well as his extradition, Certainly, we believe it's in the interest of justice to turn him over to the New York City Police Department and Manhattan District Attorney's Office, which we did. He is now in their custody. He will go forthwith to New York to await trial or prosecution for his homicide and related charges in New York. We intend to keep our case active, and we intend to essentially revisit the case when the defendant is available for prosecution in Blair County, and we'll assess that at the appropriate time. Thank you, guys.